Chapter 12. We are in chapter 12. We have pushed long and hard to get here. This is a very, very important chapter in the book of Romans and their Bible. Matter of fact, I remember my dad calling this the Bible within the Bible, because people love Romans chapter 12. There's a bunch of little, kind of do this stuff. And what's very, very, very important, and I know as a congregation you've heard this before, but there's some people out there in YouTube land that maybe have not seen the other sermons. The very first word in that chapter, what is it? Therefore. When you read a therefore, you have to ask yourself what it's there for. Paul would not say what he's going to say to you if he had not said what he has already said. That make sense? You can't start in chapter 12 without realizing this is built on the first 11 chapters. And this is a very, very important chapter. Let's read verses 1 and 2 together. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer yourself as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. There is so much in these two verses that you could preach forever on, and I plan to. So, I'm not going to do that. Therefore, in view of God's mercy. He just talked about God's mercy in chapter 11, right? Let me give you just one verse to look at. Verse 22. For God has bound all men over to disobedience, so that He may have mercy on them all. How many people out there don't need God's mercy? Everybody needs it. He bound them all over to disobedience so He could have mercy on them all. So, therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, if you have really gotten that message, if you have internalized it, if you live it, that this is me, I need mercy. And He's tried for 11 chapters to get that message across to you. If you really believe that, if you really believe you need the sacrifice of Jesus, if you have gotten that message out of Romans, he says, in view of God's mercy, I urge you to offer yourself as living sacrifices. What a strange thing that is. Now, this is one of those times that I think the NIV missed it. The NAS, the King James, is more accurate here. It says, offer your body as a living sacrifice. Why is that important? Well, remember in chapter 7 we talked about the fact that we're waiting to get a new body? That as long as we're in this body, we have a sinful nature. And then we have to struggle with that sinful nature. Do you remember that? He says, this body that you still have, the struggle that you have, he says, I urge you, in view of God's mercy, to offer it as a living something that died. Because that's what a sacrifice is. Right? Long before it was a play in baseball. Long before we talked about the sacrifices we have to make. A sacrifice was something that gave its life. You sacrificed a lamb, you sacrificed a goat, you sacrificed a bull. If you were poor, you sacrificed turtle doves. You saw that something had to die. That's very significant for what we celebrate on Sunday morning. He said, but I want you to offer your body as a sacrifice. We have all kinds of strange terminologies. I don't know if you notice this. We were talking about taking down the curtains yesterday, and we were talking about, well, the whole place is a sanctuary now, and we talked about, God's holy place and all this stuff, and everything we read in the text kind of makes us re-examine that. A lot of churches talk about an altar call, right? How many of you think of that as an altar? Yeah, right? What do you do on an altar? You sacrifice something. We've taken some of that stuff over with us into Christendom. The problem with a living sacrifice is it tends to crawl off the altar. You're free every day, every minute of that day to not be a sacrifice. You have the will, you have the ability to say, no, I am going to be in charge of this particular decision. I'm going to be in charge of this particular situation. I am going to be in charge of my life today. And at that point, you no longer are a sacrifice. You are no longer a living sacrifice. Now, if you did not have chapter 6 in Romans, this would not make a lot of sense. Because in chapter 6, he talked about you died with Christ. You were buried with Him in baptism. You were raised to a new life. You are a living something that died. That goes along with what Jesus talked about, counting the cost, giving up your life. And we make that decision every day. He says, in view of God's mercy, I urge you, brothers, to offer your body as a living sacrifice. You're struggling with your sinful nature the same way that everybody is struggling with their sinful nature. And you will until God gives you a new body. That's what he says in chapter 7 and 8, remember? He said, but you chose. When you made that decision to commit your life to Jesus, you chose to be a living sacrifice. To put to death the deeds of the body. Right? This next point is the most important point for us. He says, all of that is your spiritual worship. This is what worship is. Now, this goes against the grain of everything that you've been taught since you were knee-high. That every terminology you hear about churches and synagogues and places of worship. And on Sunday morning you would go to worship. And at 9:30 we have class. And at 10:30 we have worship. And you were taught that what we're doing right now. You were taught that listening to a sermon is worship. You were taught that singing. Opening that book, and by the way, man, our music people are sounding great. I have to say, they're complimenting each other, and that's a serious aside there, sorry. But it was very impressive, you know. When people play in harmony, it's just a magical thing. It's just something very encouraging. When people sing together in harmony, it's just an amazing thing. But you know what? That is not worship. Yes, it is, Gary. That's what we do. It says so right on the sign. And all my life they told me this is what we do. You go to worship, this is worship. Where do you have to go to worship? Church. You go to church to worship, right? And the best place to go is 6755 Atlantic Boulevard. Yep. And that's what we do. We come together, we worship. Why? Because God needs us to worship. It says so right in the text. Where does it say that? Anybody find me that text? That God needs you to come and do what we're doing on Sunday morning? Guys, it's not in there. It is not in there. God is God, and He doesn't need your worship. He doesn't need it. He can get through the week without it. Matter of fact, He can get through the whole year without it. Matter of fact, before you came along, He did just fine. He doesn't need your worship. Worship literally meaning to bow down, to lay prostrate in front, to acknowledge that somebody is over you. And In this case, acknowledge that God is God and you are not. That's what worship is. Now, does God need that? No, He already knows who He is. He's got a good self-esteem, got good self-awareness.